A quiet battle that most people overlook is what I want to talk about today. Um, this kind of starts out the initial um, my first episode here today, and I'm just I want to just explain a bit. I'm just a practical person, a practical guy who is wants a little better opportunity to try to have a little more chance at optimal health. I'm not perfect. I'm not an expert, but I am a good researcher. And after seeing, the family members and you just see people in the public that just seem to accept this, and I'm thinking of certain people, certain celebrities, certain people that was impactful when I grew up, and I think all of a sudden they just died, and and you know I know that we can't live forever, but I know that there's a better way of doing things, and there's got to be a more wiser approach to trying to get the best life we can, and so that's what's led me to kind of I'm on a journey. I'm evolving in a manner that I keep evolving, trying to look at the basic fundamentals. How did we get into this situation? Why is everybody so sick, so chronically ill? And I'm so tired of it, and I just don't want to quietly go down that street. And so I guess this channel is just about me evolving spiritually, um, trying to do it in a healthy manner, looking at the basic organics, the practical philosophy of what it is to have optimal health or try to achieve that. So what I want to talk about on this first episode, and I thank you for joining me. Um, I, and, and this is not a lecture. This is just my journey of what I'm picking, what I think is my way of evolving. And, and I hope you'll follow along and look at this in a way that I picked these things, and I've got my some notes here that I've made, and the things that really disturbed me and made me start digging down and researching these things. You got to go through all these layers to get down to the to the to the real red meat of things, and so I wanted to look back at what did our forefathers do? What did the other people, they faced these things, but what did they do? And I guess it's getting back to organic living and just examine that, not totally going off grid, but, looking at things, examining things and picking up trying to get the whole gist of the wisdom and compiling this thing into a habit, into what's our best path. So what I want to look at today is I want to look at this quiet battle that I've seen many people, and what I've researched, it seems that many overlook. And I like to call this when health fails silently, or better yet, let's put it all together in this first episode. A quiet battle most overlook when health fails silently. I think that's probably appropriate what I'm trying to talk about here. You know, it's the thing of overlooking. If we can become more aware of things, in our body, in our lives, around us. There's certain moments in life that don't fade with time. They don't seem to just scream out at you. They don't announce themselves, just real dramatically, and they don't arrive with warning, great big red flashing lights, sirens, or anything like that. They simply sit quietly in the background of our thoughts, resurfacing now and then. Usually when you least expect these things, you can be driving down a familiar road, for example, standing in line at a store, walking up the street, or just waking up early before the rest of the world stirs, looking out the window. And suddenly, a memory appears, not because we invited it, but because something in the present cued that, or it's a moment that brushed against the past. For many people, one of those moments was, looking back the day when John Ritter died. I remember when I heard about that, it's not because I knew him personally. I guess I'm a Generation Xer, and we watched a lot of that shows, and a lot of other generations did, but because when I seen that, it just didn't make sense. It just seemed too early. It just didn't sound right. John Ritter, and I'm not trying to pick on him, but just he was a character celebrity that was meaningful in our lives. He wasn't old, he wasn't fragile, he wasn't someone the public thought of as at risk. He was energetic, and kind of expressive guy, physical, always alive, and then suddenly he wasn't. He just was gone. We've seen that in many celebrities. We can look back over the years. But John was always vibrant, and watching the Three's Company show, and he was a lot of physical comedy acts. But there's just something unsettling about deaths that don't fit the story we expect. We're prepared, at least mentally, for a decline that follows a long illness. It helps us to prepare, I guess. We understand aging, we understand visible frailty, but when someone who appears strong disappears without warning, it rattles really something deep in us. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth of that appearance is not assurance, and that realization, it lingers. And so I know you've felt this before, and these are things that I'll go along a day or two and I'm thinking, gosh, and thinking about your own demise. What am I doing in my life, But listen, before I go any further, I want to be very clear about something here. This is not medical lecture. This is not a diagnosis. This is not a claim about what caused anyone's death. This is just the reflection of an event, a wondering. I'm exploring, trying to evolve, trying to make sense out of things. Because sometimes the most important questions aren't the ones that give us just the immediate quick answers. Now, they're the ones that quietly change how we live going forward in our lives. And, these can be the really crucial ones, and they linger, and we keep applying them, mix them, comparing them with our lives, what we're doing. Could it happen to us? And these things. I'm trying to just explore this and try to make some sense out of this. So when people think of John Ritter, they often think of, laughter, the timing, the movement, the physical comedy, as I was saying, that looked effortless. I mean, he played several roles. He used his body in a way very few actors ever did. He was falling, twisting, making an emotional reaction, not just with words, but with full motion. And there was so much vitality to him that it just felt genuine, and his batteries always seemed to be charged. And, the roles that he played, and he just showed a aliveness to it. And that vitality is part of, I guess that's why his passing was so jarring, and with many others. But because whether we admit it or not, we carry an unspoken belief that people who look alive, people who move easily, people who seem full of energy, people who just kind of entertain us and make us laugh, or we admire them, are somehow protected, and as if life owes them more time on this earth. But life doesn't work that way at all. Loss has a way of humbling us. It reminds us that appearances can be very deceiving. Deception is all around us, and but when we look and that strength on the outside, it doesn't always reflect what's happening inside the bodies, the internal case, the campaign of the body, whatever it's fighting. You know, as I've gotten older, I've realized something about sudden loss. It rarely stays confined to the person who passed, you know. It spreads. It spreads into the memories of family members and into conversations and that never happened, into questions that never got asked or answered. I've experienced that kind of loss personally in my life. I've watched people I love leave this world without long warning. My father and others from my past. I had a nephew that we were lost, and it was quick like that. You know, one day they were here, and the next day everything changed, and they were gone. And all of a sudden, that there's a strange silence that follows sudden loss, and it's not just the absence of the person, but the absence of the closure. You know, you rewind and replay moments in your mind. You think about the last conversation you had, the last argument, the last laugh, and eventually a different question. Different questions surface, and things keep coming up, and you kind of keep replaying that scene, and you stop asking, how did this happen? You start asking, what did we overlook? What was it? Looking for clues, you know? And that question it's not about blame, it's about responsibility. Responsibility, it doesn't mean guilt. It doesn't mean obsession, you know? It means attention, observation. It means awareness. It means asking whether there were signals we didn't recognize. Or was there patterns we never questioned, never observed? It's the overview of the whole situation. You know, that there's a common idea, you know, that in modern culture that health events happen suddenly out of nowhere, you know. A heart attack, for example, a tear, a rupture. We talk a bit about these things as if they appear overnight, you know, and just as if the body simply flips a switch and it's in fail mode. But the body doesn't usually fail that way. From what I've studied, it usually doesn't fail that way at all. And you know, when we look at the anatomy, the arterial diagram, these sorts of things, you know, when we really look at that, the body over time weakens quietly. And I've always said we're kind of like an air filter, you know. But long before a catastrophic event, these small changes are already happening beneath the surface. Structural changes, electrical changes in the body, chemical changes. The tragedy is that many of these changes don't produce obvious symptoms that you can just grab onto. They don't announce themselves. They don't announce themselves loudly enough to be noticed. In some cases, they're ignored. I'm not going to worry about that, you know. So by the time, you know, something dramatic happens in somebody's life, the story's already kind of been written, you know. We call it sudden. But in many cases, it was anything but sudden. It was slow in increments and quiet. And that's kind of how the body gets to that point. And because it was quiet, it was easy to ignore and overlook. And, you know, I think we write things off as it's just real quick, it happened, you know, but we need to really think about the breakdown of the incremental symptoms that happened. Now, this is just where I tell you, this is where my own curiosity began to deepen. Not just because I wanted answers, but the whole idea of 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 the answers to the past, the things that kept coming back up, making me stop and think and do comparisons of my own life. But because I wanted to understand how to live differently going forward, I started asking questions most people never think to ask, and unless they're forced to. These questions about the foundations, questions about what actually holds the body together in general, back to the basic fundamentals of what the body needs. Now, I began to notice something. The conversations we have most often about health they're just usually about crisis. What drug to take, what doctor do you have, what procedure to schedule, what emergency response is needed. But very few conversations are about maintenance, preventive maintenance. Very few are about the quiet systems that keep everything working day after day. It's just mind-boggling how we get kind of hypnotized, get into this state. It's like a trance. Now, over time, two things keep appearing again and again. And in my reading and research, my conversations, magnesium and copper, not as miracle substances, but vital substances that we need in our body. They're not as cures, but as fuel, as things we need, as materials, as the aggregates to our road to good health or living. Magnesium plays such a role in the electrical system of the heart. It helps regulate the rhythm. It influences relaxation of blood vessels. It supports stability. Copper plays a huge role in the structure of our skeletal structure, our body structure. It's involved in the formation of connective tissue. It supports elasticity, the ability of blood vessels to stretch and rebound without tearing apart. These aren't fringe ideas. They are basic biochemistry, and yet most people go their entire lives without ever having a meaningful conversation about either one of these two minerals, mineral and copper, that we're talking about right now. I mean, absolutely no talk about them. Occasionally you hear something about magnesium sulfate, which people refer to that not even as magnesium, but as Epsom salt. But I tell you, this is why, realization alone stopped me in my tracks, just stopped. Because when something is foundational and yet rarely discussed, it raises a big question. Now, why don't we talk about these things more? Why are they absent from everyday health conversations? And why are we so comfortable discussing, cholesterol numbers, but rarely discuss mineral balance? Those questions didn't accuse anyone. They simply asked whether our focus might be misplaced a little bit. What is the deal? These minerals are so important. Magnesium is supposed to be responsible for 300 different things in our system, operations, enzymes, and in our body. Now, looking at this total, this is where, part one of the reflection that we're talking about begins to slow down a bit. Because before we can talk about responsibility, before we can talk about prevention, before we can talk about what to do differently, we must first understand how quietly things can go wrong and how easy it is to miss what isn't loud. In the next part of this conversation, I just want to spend a little bit of time exploring that quiet space, the space where fundamentals live, in our body, the space where balance matters, the space we often just ignore, not out of malice, but out of habit. Maybe not wanting to face the reality of the whole situation, and just putting off the inevitable. We all know about little things, and you think, well, I just put it off. It could be some of that. When we talk about health in general, most conversations just revolve around what happens when something goes wrong. Symptoms, you started getting headaches or the diagnosis, emergency interventions. We're very good at reacting to these things, but reaction is not the same thing as prevention. And it's not the same thing as understanding the order of prevention. And I guess it's just good to look at it. Maybe it's prioritizing and focusing on prevention. Yes, we can prevent. Well, let's wake up and maybe that's what we need to do. Maybe that's what we need to do. Most systems don't fail loudly at first. They fail quietly. They compensate. They reroute. They adapt. And the human body is one of the most adaptive systems we know of. Now, that adaptability, it's a gift. It's a gift from God, but it can also be deceptive if we overlook what the symptoms are. Now, because when a system adapts well, it hides its weakness. The body doesn't immediately announce deficiency. It doesn't send out alarms the moment something begins to slip. Instead, it adjusts. It borrows from one area to support another. It prioritizes survival over comfort. It keeps you moving forward until one day it just can't. Now, that's like with magnesium. If you go get a blood test of magnesium, your body's going to maintain that magnesium level, because if it drops, you'll have a heart attack. But it'll pull magnesium from all different parts of the body, and you won't know that. Now, this is just where the idea of foundation becomes important. Foundations in general, everything that functions well rests on something underneath it. A building rests on its footings. A bridge rests on its supports. And the body rests on materials, not theories, not trends, materials, being minerals. Now, we have to look at this mineral foundation. When we ignore materials, we focus only on outcomes, and outcomes always show up late in the process, late in the game. Now, what I've just kind of been seeing and researching, it's just like this. I see that by the time an outcome is visible, the underlying issue has often been present for years and years, sometimes decades prior. Now that means that system was skewed, or it started getting skewed and getting worse and worse, like a plane on a flight path that's in a shallow decline, And this realization that I had, it changed how I thought about health. I stopped asking what happened and started asking what was slowly eroding. That shift led me into a deeper look at minerals in general. Not supplements as products, but minerals as participants in structure and function. Now, these minerals provided the concrete slab like a building has, and it's a foundation, as we spoke before here about the building of the body, the foundation of the body's system to operate. Now, we talked a bit about magnesium, but let's go back to magnesium. Magnesium is one of those minerals most people have heard of, but hearing a name and understanding their role are two very different things. Magnesium participates in hundreds and hundreds of enzymatic reactions, but more importantly for this conversation, it plays a role in electrical stability and the different electrical charges that go off in the body, that we have transmissions and data being sent. by electrical charge in the body. It's amazing. And every heartbeat is an electrical event. Every contraction deepens on the ions. It's ions moving across membranes. Magnesium helps regulate that movement and acts as a stabilizer. When magnesium status is adequate, electrical signals, they're smoother, more controlled, more resilient. When it isn't, that system becomes more excitable, less forgiving. Magnesium plays such an enormous role. Many people say, well, it has a calming effect. No, it allows the conductivity of the electrical system in our bodies. And that's what I've just read about, research this. What amazing. And so that doesn't mean, the general symptoms appear immediately. In many cases, the body compensates. It tightens here, it relaxes there, it adjusts thresholds. But compensation is not correction. It's a boring of time. And that's what compensation. It's give a little bit, take a little, give a little, and that weighs over time. Now copper, on the other hand, it's far less discussed, period. In fact, many people are surprised to hear it mentioned at all. We don't talk about copper at dinner tables. We don't hear it highlighted in commercials. You rarely ever see it in multivitamins. And what they do talk about, it's toxic. And yet copper is so deeply involved in the structure, in our body structure. Now, copper participates in the overall enzymes' responsibility for cross-linking connective tissue. Now that cross-linking, what I was reading about, is what gives these tissues strength and elasticity. Now I was really surprised to find out how copper played such a big role in tissue elasticity. And it's what allows arteries to expand and recall without tearing. It's what allows structure to flex without breaking, So what a big role in the vascular system that I've, just discovered that copper plays. Now, structure is not just static, doesn't just stay still. Healthy structure is dynamic. It stretches, it rebounds, it absorbs stress. And copper plays such a quiet role in that process. And how important, and it doesn't take but just a little bit of copper to bring that system up to be and bring that balance on. So a natural question arises from us. If copper is so important to connective tissue, to vascular integrity, to elasticity, why don't we hear more about it? Why isn't it discussed the way cholesterol is? Why is it emphasized the way calcium or vitamin D is? Yeah, why don't we talk about copper? Why is it demonized so much, And copper, although it's taken in small amounts, is so very important, and it's proven that over and over in the biology of our systems. Now, that silence about copper isn't accidental. Copper is not a mineral that behaves safely in isolation. It is powerful, it is reactive, and it requires balance. Copper doesn't take a lot, just a little bit, and it plays a major, major role in things. Copper does not lend itself to a one-size-fits-all. Its role depends on context, on ratios, on interactions, on the broader mineral, the whole mineral environment. And that makes it uncomfortable for the mass messaging to talk about, I guess, And after I've delved deeper into this thing about copper, and it's almost like people are scared to talk about it because you have to include it in so many other things. It's a broad context, I guess. Now, in a world that prefers simple answers, nuance is inconvenient. In a market that prefers uniformity, balance is difficult to sell. So copper quietly disappeared from many modern multivitamins, not because it isn't important, but because it can't be marketed. It can't be, you can't misunderstand copper or misuse it or take it without context. You need to have a back plate in the understanding of a copper. So that's my only assumption. With it being so important, they just said, well, we can't send out brochures and educate everybody on copper. We'll just leave it out. So that's the only thing that I can come up with. When something doesn't fit neatly and you can't just package it into the mass marketing scheme, it often gets left out of the conversation entirely. And when it's left out long enough, people assume it really don't matter. And that's certainly not what's right with copper. It is so very important. And, the more I research it, the more I'm astounded by the lacking of what's been taught about copper. It's there. You just have to research it. What's interesting, though, is that copper never truly disappeared from medicine at all. It simply moved into quieter spaces in cardiology and internal medicine. Copper status is not an unknown concept. It's not fringe. It's not imaginary. It's not irrelevant. Now, copper is so very, very relevant, And when we talk about the many, in certain situations, for example, physicians will order blood work to assess copper levels, especially when there are unexplained cardiovascular issues, connective tissue concerns, patterns that don't make sense on standard panels. That alone tells us something important about copper, They're looking for clues. Was the copper levels too low that didn't allow for the elasticity for the vascular system? Copper is very important. And like I said, this tells us that what matters most in the body often operates quietly. It doesn't advertise itself. It doesn't trend. It simply does its job until it can't. And that means if it can't, it usually don't have enough of the material, or you're deficient. The body can be deficient and it just can't do its job. Now, one of the things, what struck me wasn't just the importance of these two minerals. It was how easily deficiencies could develop. The modern Western diets are often low in mineral density. We got soil depletion, the food processing, convenience of eating, all these packaged up rolls of food that we have that's all a part of this process. Now, all of it plays a big role in the deficiencies that we're seeing or the lack of. So, our lives are moving so quick now, and stress increases mineral loss. Chronic stress signals the body to burn these resources faster and faster. Certain medications interfere with absorption or increase excretion, and none of this happens overnight. It goes back to what I was saying, kind of like the air filter. Air filter over time. It don't get dirty overnight, but it gets dirty and clogged over time. And so the body adapts. It compensates. It relocates. It keeps you functional. That's why people often say he was just fine yesterday, but fine doesn't always mean well. It doesn't always mean well supported. The underlying issues is what we're talking about now and what needs to be seen. Many of these underlying issues, many warning signs, they're just not dramatic. Fatigue that feels normal, tension that feels familiar, sleep that feels lighter than it used to be. Because they don't feel urgent, they're easy to just dismiss and say, oh, it's just a part of this or part of that. And you kind of compensate. You compensate mentally and I guess you compensate physically too. That's what it looks like to me, But time accumulates, and small imbalances left unaddressed they just don't stay small forever. They can be ticking time bombs, And so this is why I'm so very important. What I can tell from this is why patterns matter so much. Not one lab result, not one symptom, but trends over time, trends in the diet, trends in stress, trends in overall neglect of these systems that are causing skewed systems in our body. So there's a phrase we hear often. It runs in the family, but sometimes what runs in the family isn't destiny. It's habit. It's unexamined patterns passed down quietly. You know, well, my grandma did that, or my grandma drank that, or my granddad drank that, or my dad did that, or ate that, and it just keeps continuing. Nobody stops to think, hey, and just regular dietary habits, the overall dietary habits, the stress responses, the mineral depletion over decades. If we don't question those patterns, we just get into a loop and you just keep repeating these things. And we have to step back sometimes, and just say, what's happening, Now, repetition don't have to be fate. It's familiarity, and familiarity feels safe even when it isn't, We can just go back to that same water well and drink from it just because the grandfather and the father and all the relatives did, but maybe it's poison we're drinking from and it slowly is killing us, but we don't recognize it. Now, I'm not suggesting that magnesium or copper are magic shields. I'm suggesting something much simpler. The body's built from materials, from minerals. And when those materials are depleted over time, the overall, it's just common sense, the overall structure, it weakens. It's like a building. And our bodies are not static. They're always moving, generating new cells, new skin cells. So, if we wait until something breaks to start asking questions, we've waited really, from the best that I can tell, just way too long. Not because the questions are wrong, but because they're late in coming. It's when we need to look back and try to formulate a preventative type sense. Now, this way of thinking doesn't lead to fear. It leads. I'm trying to evolve to where I can lead to more of awareness, and leading to asking better questions at certain better times. In the next part of this reflection, I just want to move beyond minerals alone and talk about responsibility, about the dignity, about what it means to live attentively, not perfectly, but intentionally, because understanding foundations is only the beginning of this. What matters most is what we choose to do with that understanding. Or I feel that's what I'm seeing. That's what I have been evolving to. These are the answers that I'm coming up with, and I'm researching a lot of this. And I don't know. We I think that we just need to be on a different road, be more aware of things ahead of time. Um, Awareness is such an important thing. At some point, this line of thinking just stops being about celebrities altogether, and high profile people. And it always catches our attention when it does, but because no matter how public the story is, no matter how familiar the face is, the questions eventually turn inward on ourselves. They stop being about what happened to someone else and start becoming about how we ourselves are living. What are we doing? Are we doing the same thing? Are we drinking from the same well as that entertainer did because they did it? It just step back and think about things and kind of be an individual about this. That's my thinking. I realized that I wasn't really trying to understand why someone else died. I think I was just trying to understand how to live, how to avoid being another sudden story like that, how to avoid in my own life leaving behind unanswered questions for the people and that I love, and not to go down that same path just because they did it, or, you know, just to try to answer these questions, to try to apply it to ourselves, because, once you've experienced unexpected loss, something changes. You don't become fearful. You don't become obsessed, but you do become attentive. You start listening differently. You start noticing patterns you once ignored. You start realizing that responsibility isn't something imposed from the outside. It's something that quietly arrives from within. It it's the perspective. You look at things now and you think, I'm in, I'm invincible. I did that same thing. It could happen to me. And so you go back and say, what can I do to prevent? Well, I say responsibility, but let me be clear. Responsibility doesn't mean living in constant vigilance. It doesn't mean scanning your body for every possible symptom. And it certainly doesn't mean trying to control what can't be controlled. Now, responsibility means just participation. It means refusing to live passively in your own body. Kind of be in charge, be aware, be the watchman for your body. But you have to do it in balance, just like with minerals. Everything is in balance, and you try to work to that. So most people don't fail their health out of just pure rebellion. They fail it out of a drift from the truth, out of habit, out of postponement, out of the quiet belief that there will always be time later. Always put it off and put it off, and and we're all guilty of that. I'm guilty of that. I've done it a lot. And once you get a few years on, you get past 40, 50 years old, and you start thinking about all this stuff, say, hey, that guy is my age, or so it makes you think, we live in a culture that treats decline as inevitable, that frames aging as a slow surrender, that it normalizes fatigue, stiffness, and chronic discomfort as simple. It's just how it goes. And when decline is framed as normal, curiosity just is there's a wall. It just feels unnecessary. No need to be curious anymore. We've answered that question. It's just aging. But inevitability is often a story, we just tell ourselves to avoid responsibility, not because responsibility is so heavy on us, but because it asks us to pay attention, and attention requires effort. So, some don't want to put the effort, but there's a difference. There's a difference between accepting reality and surrendering to overall neglect. Accepting reality means you've got to acknowledge that we're finite. Surrendering to neglect means refusing to take care of what we've been given. Just like if you had a car, you'd try to take care of it. You're not going to live forever, but if you change it all and take care of it, it'll last as long as, possible, reasonable. So these two things they're just not the same, So this is where the idea of dignity enters the conversation. Now, dignity, from what I understand, it isn't about living forever. It's about living well for as long as we are here. It's about staying engaged with life instead of quietly just checking out or passing time. I used to have a friend of mine that had a saying, he said, the guy was somebody, he said, went to the doctor, got all these pills, but living longer, but doing it wronger, So that's something to think about, but this way of thinking leads us to better questions, not just frantic ones, honest ones. I'm supporting the systems that keep me alive. Am I strengthening my foundation or only reacting to the symptoms? Am I living as if time is guaranteed or as if it matters overall? So it's trying to realign with some wisdom here. That's what I'm trying to learn about. That's what I want to try to learn about. And these questions don't just accuse, they kind of invite. They don't demand perfection. These questions encourage evolving into a greater awareness, is what I think. Now, no matter what we do to make our living, whether we work with our hands, work with our minds in offices, in the field, or at home, there is one role none of us can just simply outsource. And, that role is the captain of our own ship. You know, we all we just all have to be we all have to become responsible researchers into our own health. That doesn't mean we all become doctors. It doesn't mean we pretend to know everything, and it certainly doesn't mean we reject guidance or help. It means we stay engaged. And I've said before, you got to be the captain of your own ship. But in order to be a good captain, you got to make sure you got a good compass. In order to have the good compass, you got to know a little something about how to read the directions on it. Also, we need to remain curious, open-minded. We need to keep evolving, learning. We need to pay attention, because health isn't something that happens to us only when it fails. It's something we participate in every day, whether we realize it or not. I remember when my dad got sick and we just run to the hospital, all of a sudden, boom, we wasn't thinking about anything prior to that. And then you're faced with these things. You don't know what this means or what that means. And I think we need to have a running research going all the time in this preventive area. The danger isn't ignorance by itself. The danger is settling into the ignorance, accepting the idea that decline is inevitable, just making excuses to stop asking questions, convincing ourselves that nothing can be done anymore, so nothing should be tried. I think these are really important things that we need to deal with. This is how people slowly travel down a well-worn out path of poor health. Not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly just settling, over time. And once that path feels familiar, it becomes easy to stay on it. Oh, he got sick, went to the doctor, they gave him this, gave him that, and just a stair step down. Not that all of this is bad, but sometimes we just go and said, fix me, We don't take responsibility. What can you be doing 5 or 10 years before that? But we don't have to. We can choose differently. We can choose to stay engaged with our well-being. We can choose to monitor, to learn, to adjust. And, best of all, we can, with the information we have available now, we have the time to invest in this for the importance of optimal living, as best as we can. Now, it's not going to be perfect, and not perfectly, not fearfully, but responsibly, because even when outcomes aren't guaranteed, effort still matters. There's something deeply human about refusing to give up on life quietly and just throw your hands up. It's like going down with the ship, I guess. But I've always liked to say that I'm a foolish optimist, and I try to be always looking for hope. Now, about choosing to fight, not in anger, not in panic, but with awareness, with intention, with care for your body, just choosing to be aware, at least know what's going on, and then move from that direction. Now, always, to fight for life. It doesn't mean denying reality. It means honoring it. It means respecting the body enough to learn how it works, and humbling ourselves enough to admit when we we still have more to understand. Now, this is our system. I think this is the wise approach to not having these surprises, or at least doing the best we can to try to avoid them. And if there's one thing that loss teaches us, it's this. This is not promise, but responsibility is, and how we choose to live, how attentively, how thoughtfully, is something no one can take from us at all. Now, we look back and we was talking again about John Ritter. And John Ritter made, as we all know, made people laugh. And my father gave me life. Neither of them owed us any lessons. And as I look back on things, I just think, but if their stories encourage us to look sooner, to ask older, just to ask earlier what's happening, to take responsibility for our own foundations, then something meaningful comes from the loss. This conversation isn't about certainty, it's about care. It's about awareness. I believe what we're really searching for is wisdom. Wisdom that can be applied in our daily lives. Wisdom that allows us to live a little longer with dignity, a little more intentionally, a little less passively, because simply floating downstream, watching others suffer through the years of chronic discomfort and decline, man, that's not living to me. And I want to try to do everything I can to fight that. I'm fearful of that, and I'm trying to do everything, try to evolve, to have wisdom to fight that all that I can. I don't want to go down without a fight, and I'm sure you're the same way. And for those who want to explore this conversation more deeply, especially the foundational role that minerals like magnesium and copper play, and how they play over time, I've written a book called The Magnesium and Copper Connection. It's simply where I gathered and organized what I kept discovering along the way. No urgency, no promises, just information, patterns, and questions worth considering. It's amazing what these two minerals have done. And I'm just thankful that I was able to run across it and see, what they did. They've helped me, and I continue to take them. And like I said, I'm evolving and learning more about them. But listen, you take care. And I think the best we can do is keep moving forward. Each day adding a little more awareness, a little more responsibility, a little more respect for life. This is the end of my vlog, and thank you for watching. Appreciate you.